They laughed first, not politely, not quietly, but openly, the kind of laughter that ripples through a room when men believe they are witnessing proof that history itself is on their side. In the early months of the war against the United States, German generals sat in briefing rooms thick with cigarette smoke and confidence, listening to intelligence reports about American industry and American methods. Again and again, the same detail came up, and again, it triggered amusement rather than concern. Trucks, endless trucks, long columns of them, stretching across American training grounds, rolling out of ports, clogging roads behind newly raised divisions. To the German officer corps, raised on rail timetables, iron discipline, and the belief that wars were decided by tanks and guns, trucks seemed almost childish. Improvised, inelegant, wasteful, one general reportedly smirked that Americans thought war could be won by delivery boys. The Wehrmacht had conquered half of Europe without such excess. France had fallen in weeks. The Low Countries had collapsed. Even deep inside the Soviet Union, German armies had advanced hundreds of miles on what they considered efficient logistics. Railways mattered, fuel mattered, but trucks were supporting actors, not the stars. Real armies, the Germans believed, advanced on rails and fought with precision. The American obsession with motor transport looked like overcompensation by an inexperienced power that didn't yet understand war. And so the laughter continued. In Berlin, staff officers studied photographs of American supply depots. Miles of crates, mountains of spare parts, warehouses packed with tires, engines, tools, and canned food. Someone joked that the Americans were preparing to open the largest automobile repair shop in history. Another remarked that if the Americans ever ran out of bullets, at least they could throw tires at the enemy. The humor spread because it felt safe, it felt correct. It fit perfectly with the long-standing German belief that Americans were technically clever but strategically shallow, wealthy but soft, industrial but undisciplined. They were wrong, but it took time for reality to arrive, and when it did, it arrived on wheels. The first encounters didn't change many minds. In North Africa, German officers observed American units struggling, learning, adapting in public. At Kasserine Pass, German commanders saw confirmation of their assumptions. American troops retreated, coordination faltered, command structures cracked under pressure, and behind those retreating units rolled, once again, columns of trucks. Too many trucks, disorganized trucks, trucks parked in the open, vulnerable to air attack, trucks abandoned by frightened drivers. German officers shook their heads. This, they believed, was proof. The Americans didn't know how to fight. They compensated with quantity. They substituted steel for skill. But beneath the surface of those early failures, something else was happening, something German intelligence noticed only dimly. The American trucks kept coming. Losses were replaced not in months, but in days. A destroyed convoy was an inconvenience, not a catastrophe. Units that retreated 1 week were re-equipped the next. Fuel shortages that would have paralyzed a German formation barely slowed American ones. Even in defeat, the American system absorbed punishment and kept moving. The German way of war had always assumed that logistics were a constraint to be managed carefully, even sparingly. The American way assumed logistics were a weapon to be wielded aggressively. This difference, subtle at first, would grow into a chasm. By 1943, as the tide began to turn, German generals found fewer reasons to laugh. In Sicily and Italy, American and Allied forces advanced under conditions that should have favored the defender. Mountains, narrow roads, weather that turned tracks into mud. German planners expected supply problems to stall the attackers. They did not. When bridges were blown, American engineers built new ones. When roads collapsed, trucks found alternate routes. When ports were damaged, temporary harbors and improvised unloading methods appeared almost overnight. The trucks did not stop. They detoured, adjusted, rerouted, and kept delivering. German reports began to note this with irritation rather than humor. Enemy supply movements appear inexhaustible, one officer wrote. Another complained that American units seemed able to attack at times and places that made no logistical sense. How, they asked, could an army push forward so relentlessly without pausing to consolidate? The answer was simple, but it violated everything German officers had been taught to believe. The Americans were not constrained by logistics in the traditional sense. They were empowered by it. Still, many clung to old assumptions. Italy, they told themselves, was an exception. The real test would be France. When the invasion came in June 1944, German generals watched with a mixture of dread and curiosity. The scale was immense, but scale alone did not frighten them. What mattered was sustainability. Could the Allies maintain this force across the Channel, under fire, against a determined defense? German planners believed they could not. Ports would be destroyed, roads would be bombed, supply lines would stretch and snap. The Americans would discover, painfully, that war was not a factory problem that could be solved by production quotas. For a brief moment it seemed they might be right. The German defense in Normandy was ferocious. Bocage country swallowed tanks. Allied units advanced yard by yard. Supply dumps piled up near the beaches, and congestion became severe. German intelligence intercepted reports of shortages, ammunition rationing, fuel delays. Once again laughter flickered, though more quietly now. The Americans, it seemed, were finally learning the limits of their truck-based fantasy. Then the breakout came. Operation Cobra shattered the German front, and what followed stunned even seasoned officers. American units did not advance cautiously. They exploded outward. Armored columns raced across France at a speed that defied German calculations. Towns fell in hours. Bridges were seized intact or repaired almost instantly. German commanders issued orders that became obsolete before they reached the front. And always behind the tanks and infantry came the trucks. They came in numbers the Germans had never imagined. 6x6 cargo trucks, fuel tankers, repair vehicles, ambulances, mobile kitchens. They drove day and night, headlights off, engines humming in endless streams. American soldiers joked that the war was being won by the truck drivers, and for once the joke was not an exaggeration. Supplies flowed forward so fast that front-line units sometimes found themselves with more fuel and ammunition than they could immediately use. The Germans tried to respond with familiar methods: blow bridges, crater roads, attack supply lines. But the Americans did not rely on single lines. They created networks. When one route was cut, trucks diverted to others. When railways were destroyed, trucks replaced them. When fuel consumption skyrocketed, more fuel was delivered. The famous Red Ball Express, improvised under pressure, became a symbol of something German doctrine had never truly grasped: flexibility at scale. German officers began to report something unprecedented. They were not being defeated primarily by enemy fire. They were being outpaced. Their units arrived at defensive positions without fuel. Tanks that could have counterattacked sat idle. Artillery units rationed shells. Infantry marched on foot, while American columns roared past on roads that should have been impassable. Orders from higher command demanded attacks that could not be executed because vehicles had empty tanks. At first, German generals blamed individuals, poor planning, bad luck, sabotage, but the pattern repeated too often across too many fronts to ignore. American logistics were not merely supporting operations, they were dictating them. The Americans could choose when and where to fight because their supplies could reach those points. The Germans increasingly fought where they were forced to, dictated by fuel availability rather than strategic intent. By late summer 1944, the laughter was gone. In conferences held in forest clearings and ruined chateaus, German commanders spoke in grim tones about gasoline. Not tactics, not morale, gasoline. Panzer divisions that existed on paper were hollow in reality. A battalion might have 30 tanks, but fuel for 10. Trucks requisitioned from civilians broke down and could not be repaired. Spare parts were scarce. Allied air power destroyed refineries and rail hubs faster than they could be repaired. The German logistical system, once praised for its efficiency, proved brittle under sustained pressure. Meanwhile, American trucks rolled on. There was something deeply unsettling about it to German officers trained to respect limits. The Americans seemed to have none. When one supply solution became insufficient, they created another. Temporary pipelines were laid across France to pump fuel directly from ports. Engineers rebuilt railways even as trucks continued to carry the load. Warehouses appeared in liberated towns within days. The sheer redundancy of the system was overwhelming. Destroying one element did not cripple it. It merely shifted the burden elsewhere. A German general reportedly remarked, with bitter admiration, that the Americans had turned logistics into a form of mass. Not massed troops, but massed capability. It was like fighting an opponent whose strength regenerated faster than it could be diminished. As autumn approached, German hopes briefly revived, weather worsened, supply lines stretched longer. The Allies paused to regroup. Fuel shortages began to affect American units as well. German planners saw opportunity. If they could strike hard, exploit Allied overextension, perhaps the Americans would finally be strangled by their own appetite for movement. This thinking led, in part, to the Ardennes offensive. German commanders believed that a bold thrust could disrupt Allied logistics, capture fuel depots, and force the Americans to halt. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, how dependent modern armies were on fuel, and for once they aimed to turn that dependency against their enemy. For a few days it seemed to work. American units were surprised, roads clogged, confusion reigned. Fuel dumps were overrun. German officers felt a flicker of something dangerously close to hope. If they could seize enough gasoline, their panzers might reach the Meuse. The Americans, they believed, would collapse once their trucks ran dry, but once again they misunderstood what they were facing. The American response was chaotic, imperfect, but relentless. Trucks rerouted, supplies were diverted. Emergency measures were implemented at a speed that stunned observers. Units fought on reduced rations without losing cohesion. Airlift supplemented ground transport. And when the weather cleared, Allied aircraft resumed their assault on German columns, turning captured fuel into a liability as vehicles were destroyed before they could use it. The German offensive stalled, not because of a single battle, but because it ran out of what had been haunting them for months. Fuel tanks stopped by the roadside. Crews abandoned vehicles that could have fought if only they could move. Orders demanding renewed attacks went unanswered, not out of cowardice, but because engines would not start. On the other side of the lines, American trucks kept moving, even through snow and ice, delivering fuel to units pushing back the offensive. German officers watching this unfold understood, at last, the full irony of their earlier laughter. The Americans had not been naive. They had been preparing for exactly this kind of war, a war of movement, of distance, of sustained pressure. A war where victory belonged not to the army that advanced fastest in the first weeks, but to the one that could keep advancing month after month. By early 1945, the outcome was no longer in doubt. German generals wrote reports that read less like analyses and more like confessions. They spoke of an enemy whose logistical capabilities exceeded anything previously known. They acknowledged that American trucks had made possible an operational tempo the Wehrmacht could not match. Some even admitted that traditional German disdain for motorized supply had been a fatal blind spot. In the ruins of the Reich, as Allied forces closed in, the contrast became stark. American units arrived with full fuel tanks, fresh rations, and spare parts. German units arrived exhausted, under strength, and immobilized. Tanks were used as static bunkers because they could not be fueled. Artillery was abandoned for lack of shells. Retreats turned into routes not because soldiers lacked courage, but because movement itself had become impossible. The laughter from the early years echoed faintly, now stripped of humor. The same trucks once dismissed as symbols of excess had become instruments of inevitability. They carried not just supplies, but time, flexibility, and choice. They allowed American commanders to make mistakes without being destroyed by them, to recover, to adapt, and to press forward again. After the war, some German generals reflected more honestly. In memoirs and interrogations, they admitted that they had underestimated the significance of American logistics. They had focused on weapons, formations, and doctrine, while dismissing the infrastructure that made those things effective. They had believed that war could be reduced to elegant principles. The Americans had treated it as a massive, messy problem of scale and solved it accordingly. The trucks, once laughed at, had done their quiet work. They did not roar like tanks or thunder like artillery. They did not inspire fear in the traditional sense, but they moved constantly, relentlessly, carrying the weight of an entire war on their axles. And in the end, when German armies found themselves stranded, out of fuel, out of options, it was not a single battle that defeated them. It was the steady hum of engines in the distance, growing louder every day until there was nowhere left to go.